Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending tonight's Research Tuesday event, Our New Right to Disconnect. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains, and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses here at North Terrace, at Waite and at Roseworthy are all built. My name is Hayley Parkinson, and I'm currently a PhD student here at the University of Adelaide, and I'm going to be your MC for tonight. Tonight, we're here to learn about how the global shift to remote working during the pandemic has led to availability creep, and an unspoken expectation that employees must be accessible to their workplace at all times. But new right to disconnect laws are set to redefine these boundaries and enable a more equitable work-life balance. We have here tonight with us Dr Gabrielle Golding, and she's going to explain these laws. She's a senior lecturer in law who frequently comments and writes on employment matters in media, contributing to publications such as BBS, The Guardian, the Sydney Morning Herald, and more. Please join me now in welcoming Dr Golding to the stage.
Thank you all so much for being here this evening. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I also want to start by acknowledging the country that we're on this evening, the land of the Kaurna people. And in their honour, I want to say Nina Mani to all of you. That means hello in Kaurna language. Now, I think that this particular topic places quite a large elephant in the room at this time of the evening. In fact, it's 5:30 p.m. and it's outside my normal working hours. But I'm absolutely delighted to be here still this evening. This is a topic that has captured so much interest, both in my research and in the media very, very recently. And in fact, as we'll come to see, it is something that has actually developed quite recently. So in terms of what I'm going to cover this evening, I'll give you a bit of an overview. We'll understand the nature of the new right. So what does this actually mean in Australian law? How is the right structured, and what might it mean for you either as an employer of employees or as an employee yourself? We'll look at some international approaches to the right as well, because as you'll come to realise, Australia is now not alone in having its own right to disconnect. There are a number of other countries, most obviously France, that I'll touch on, that already have a right to disconnect, and they have done for quite some time. I then want to look at the whole point of the right to disconnect. So why is this even a necessary thing for us to have in Australian labour law? What has brought it about, and why is it necessary, not just from the employee's perspective, but why might this also be beneficial and necessary from the employer's perspective? So in any labour law research, I think it's really important that we consider rights like this and entitlements like this from both the employee's side and the employer's side. I'll also look at the loopholes that are to be closed by this particular right to disconnect, because of course it has come about by reason of the Closing Loopholes number 2 amendments to our Fair Work Act. I also want to touch on some of the myths that have been flying around about the right to disconnect. Some of those I've found quite amusing, to say the very least, and I'll tell you exactly why I think that they are wrong. And then I want to consider, where do we head to from here? So I always like to leave people at lectures like this with something to take away that they can implement practically in their own lives as an employee or as an employer. So what can you take away from today, with the fact in mind that this right to disconnect is set to commence for most employees from the 26th of August this year. So that's really only 6 weeks away from now. So first and foremost, I wanted to, open with a quote that I think really encapsulates the need for a right to disconnect. Now, this quote is taken from an interview that Benoit Hamon of the French National Assembly mentioned to the BBC when he was asked about why France needs a right to disconnect. This was in 2016, before the French right to disconnect became part of legislation there in 2017. And he said, employees will physically leave the office, but they don't necessarily leave their work. They remain attached by a kind of electronic leash, like a dog. The texts, the messages, the emails, they colonize the life of the individual to the point where he or she or they eventually breaks down. So this, I guess, at the time it was said, back in 2016, was a pretty powerful statement to be made about the need for a right to disconnect in France. Now, I think that when we cast our minds to the Australian position, we can almost transplant that kind of understanding about the fact that people are constantly connected through mobile phones. I mean, I've still got mine up here with me by the lectern. I'm so attached to it. And I'm sure that there are emails waiting for me on there. But we're absolutely connected by phones constantly, by emails constantly, by electronic devices that we have at home. We also have had time where we were forced to work at home during the pandemic. So through no choice of our own, in fact, we were told, due to public health orders, that we needed to spend more time working at home. And so what that meant, at least from my perspective as a labour lawyer, is that I noticed how much more work I was tending to do whilst at home. And I found that when I looked a bit more closely into the Australian position at the time, that there was no right to disconnect for Australian employees. We weren't anything close to France. In fact, all that we had in our Fair Work Act was maximum working hours, 38 hours a week for a full-time equivalent employee, subject to what was called reasonable additional hours in the Act. Now, if anyone could tell me what reasonable additional hours looks like in their job, I think you've kind of got labour law solved, don't you? I find that question really pervasive. And at the time I thought, well, even though there's meant to be a cap on reasonable additional hours, as the legislation says, there isn't anything to stop people from being bothered while working at home in particular. So it got me thinking about whether we could have a right to disconnect recognised in Australia. So I started thinking about this from a labour law perspective from around 2019, 2020. I think it's then unsurprising that when the Australian Council for Trade Unions decided to look at this more closely when more work was being performed from home, they formed a working from home Charter of Rights. And in that Charter of Rights, there was explicit rights that were advocated for those working from home, including the suggestion that there should be a right to disconnect for those people working at home. But up until very, very recently, the Australian Parliament had paid no attention whatsoever to the fact that we might need a right to disconnect from work. I'm very pleased to say that that lack of law was what spurred me on to write a piece that was published in the UNSW Law Journal. It's called "The Right to Disconnect in Australia, Creating Space for a New Term Implied by Law." So in that article, what I did was trace through the various legal options that might be available to somebody to pursue a right to disconnect in Australia. And you've got to remember that this was written at a time where there was nothing said in the Fair Work Act about disconnecting. I identified that it could be done by way of a workplace policy document, and indeed, strangely for German car companies, they had a right to disconnect in their workplace policy documents already. It could be an express contractual term, so it could be written into someone's employment contract as an express term. It could be implied as a contractual term. So what I mean by implied is that a court decides to insert it as a term because it sees that it's necessary to operate in an employment contract. Now, the law around that is quite murky and challenging, and I certainly don't have all that much time to go into it this evening, but it's an option. It could be inserted by way of an enterprise agreement. So if you have an agreement reached between employees and their employer at the workplace level, you may see a right to disconnect in an instrument like that. And indeed, Victoria Police have had in their enterprise agreement a right to disconnect for some time now. It could be inserted by way of a modern award, and indeed, this is a bit of a spoiler alert, that's actually where we've landed. We have a right to disconnect inserted into all modern awards now in Australia. I also identified that it could be a national employment standard, so that being one of the minimum entitlements that's available to employees throughout the country as a matter of course. And in fact, when the Greens proposed a right to disconnect, very soon after that article I wrote came out, they picked up on the idea that you could have a right to disconnect by way of the national employment standards. So you have this minimum entitlement that applies to everybody. So at this point, the Greens had very helpfully picked up on that research, but it ended up being that despite the bill being introduced into federal parliament, it didn't go anywhere. So the bill actually ended up lapsing. And to my mind, I thought, well, maybe that's it for our right to disconnect, but this remains a live issue. People are still overworking in extreme amounts. We are still constantly connected. So, interestingly enough, at the start of this year, there was a need for the Labor government to pass its second tranche of closing loopholes amendments to the Fair Work Act. It needed the Greens' support to get those last amendments across the line. And I'm very pleased to say that due to some backdoor negotiations, this right to disconnect got put into the Fair Work Act kind of at the last minute. And it's actually now been fleshed out in such a way that it's much more comprehensive than it was when it was first introduced in the Greens bill. And what I want to do is actually take you through what that right now looks like, because it's coming into operation in, as I said at the start, in about 6 weeks' time from now on the 26th of August. So this new legislative right, there's a right to disconnect term that needs to be inserted into all modern awards. A modern award has to include a right to disconnect term. It mustn't prejudice our national security or defence either. As I said, it commences operation on the 26th of August this year. But if it's the case that you work in a small business or you're a small business employer, as in one with 15 employees or less on a head count, then you've got an extra year in which the right will then operate on the 26th of August 2025. So what does this new right actually look like in words? It says that under section 333M1 of the Fair Work Act, that an employee may refuse to monitor, read, or respond to contact or attempted contact from an employer outside of the employee's working hours unless the refusal is unreasonable. Now, in terms of determining what is reasonable and unreasonable contact, I dare say that this is something that's going to get ironed out as we start to see some test cases being brought to the Fair Work Commission. You might think, well, what about if I'm an employee that does shift work? What if my shift changes and I need to know about that? Is it unreasonable in the circumstances for my employer to contact me and let me know about that outside my normal working hours? I would say that when we look at the reasonableness requirements under section 333M3, contact like that is okay. It's perfectly reasonable to let someone know that their shift time has changed. On the flip side though, if you have, say, a manager who is contacting an employee outside their normal working hours to say, please make sure you've got that report on my desk by no later than 8:30 a.m. tomorrow morning, and here are all these other things that I'd like you to include in it, and that happens by email, then I would say that that definitely falls in the unreasonable category. A few things to note about this right. It also applies to contact from third parties. So if you are in a service delivery type business, it will apply to customers or clients of the business. I would say that for those of us here who are university lecturers, I would say a third party could also be a student. Now, if that's the case, there is a right to disconnect. This also constitutes a workplace right for Part 3(1) purposes under the Fair Work Act. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that all sounds like Greek to me. I'm not a labour lawyer. But what I mean by that is that if you contact someone outside of their normal working hours and you don't observe their right to disconnect, that can also simultaneously constitute adverse action if you don't observe their right to disconnect. Adverse action carries substantial penalties under the Fair Work Act. It is its own separate cause of action. And I'll get into some of the other causes of action that are sort of linked to this right to disconnect too, which is, I guess, hinting at the fact that this isn't just something to be sneezed at. There are penalties that can attach to not observing someone's right to disconnect. If there's a right that's in an enterprise agreement that is more favourable than the statutory right as I've listed at the top of the slide there, then the more favourable right under the enterprise agreement will trump that originating right in the Fair Work Act. Now, I want to think about the process that one might follow if they were minded to challenge their right to disconnect from work. So the Act says that an employee or an employer can raise a dispute regarding contact or attempted contact outside of an employee's normal working hours. So crucially, it is not just the employee who can suggest that they are exercising a right to disconnect and therefore ought not be contacted. An employer could say, well, actually, you're exercising that right unreasonably in the circumstances. We should be able to contact you to, let's say, let you know about your change of shift, for example. So this isn't just a one-sided right in that regard. Discussion then needs to occur first at the workplace level to try and work things out, so that parties can avoid needing to go to the Fair Work Commission unnecessarily. And I think process-wise, my hope would be, and my expectation would be, that most people in situations where they are perhaps debating whether they can exercise their right to disconnect or not, would be able to iron those issues out at the workplace level by just having a discussion. But if that is not the case and there is a challenge to be had by either the employer or the employee, then what can be done is an application made to the Fair Work Commission. That is an application for a stop order such that whatever the behaviour is needs to stop. It's a little bit like, for those who are familiar with the Fair Work's anti-bullying jurisdiction, making an application for a stop bullying order. It has the, I guess, similar flavour to it. The Fair Work Commission's due to release a guideline about how this process is to work, but I can suggest it's probably going to be quite similar to what I've got up on the slide. Now, if we head to the next stage of the dispute process, the Fair Work Commission then needs to deal with any dispute that's brought or an application for a stop order that's brought. The Fair Work Commission might then decide to make the stop order. It might decide to require that the parties go through conciliation or arbitration to try and work out the issues that are between them. But it may be the case that a stop order is in fact made, and that the behaviour, as in the contact that is happening outside someone's normal working hours, must stop. Let's cast our minds forward into the future for a moment then. What if the behaviour doesn't stop? What if you are still getting emails asking you to complete those reports by 8:30 a.m. in the morning? What then? So let's say an employer ignores a stop order once it's been made by the Fair Work Commission. It is the case then that they may be subject to a penalty under the Fair Work Act, and a civil penalty at that. These can rack up quite high in terms of amounts. I'll give you some figures just so you can think about the, potential severity of this. For an individual making one single contravention, so one breach of a stop order, the penalty could be $18,780 per contravention. If you are a business with 15 or less employees, it could be $93,900 per contravention. If you're larger than 15 employees, $469,500 per contravention as a maximum. That is a lot of money for breaching a stop order. So that's why I want to stress the fact that this is not something to be sneezed at. There are penalties that could attach to this, and particularly where those stop orders are ignored. You might notice that at the bottom of the slide there, I've mentioned that there's no longer a criminal penalty that applies to this. Because these amendments to the Fair Work Act went through Parliament very, very rapidly, the drafters at the time missed the need to correct the Fair Work Act to remove the criminal penalty for a breach of a stop order. I would say that it would be, to my mind at least, entirely disproportionate for someone's boss to end up in jail for sending an email outside of someone's normal working hours asking them to do some work. I think, a monetary penalty is probably going to cut it here. So what has happened is we've had that removed by reason of the Fair Work Amendment Bill, which has just passed through Parliament only a matter of weeks ago now. So that's kind of the lay of the land in terms of the process that one might follow if you are thinking about seeking a stop order, whether you are an employee or an employer. I should also mention too that the Act makes it very clear that this is not to prohibit a work health and safety claim. To suggest that perhaps by being continually emailed or contacted about work outside of normal working hours, that may have created what is known in work health and safety law as a psychosocial hazard, and thereby inducing a breach of an employer's duty of care as a person conducting a business or undertaking under the Work Health and Safety Act that applies in the relevant jurisdiction. So not only do you have the threat of a stop order, you have the potential for an adverse action claim, you also have the potential for a work health and safety breach if you are contacting employees outside of normal working hours when you should not be. Okay, so where has this all come from? I like to think in terms of comparing Australia to other jurisdictions that have seen the right for some time. And you'll remember from the beginning of this lecture that I mentioned France. So in the beginning of 2017, French labour law introduced a statutory right to disconnect. It was seen as extremely progressive at the time because they were effectively the first country to implement something like this in statute. So the aim of it was to reduce the amount of time that employees were spending in their work-related inboxes during the evenings and on weekends. I can tell you that the French right, however, is not necessarily all wine and croissants and lovely things that, you know, French people might do after they finish work at 5:30 p.m. at night. In fact, the right is actually quite weak. It is simply a right to negotiate a workplace policy document about disconnecting if the business is 50 employees or larger. So for each individual workplace that is 50 employees or larger in France, they must have a policy about disconnecting, but it doesn't say what disconnecting must actually look like and how it applies, whereas our right is actually quite different. It's much more prescriptive than that. So I would say then that there are a number of reasons why we might criticise the right as it exists in France. I then think back to the Australian position and what the whole point of this right to disconnect is. Like, why is it that we need this? And I would say that we've seen a substantial erosion of the work and private life divide. And I would say that I certainly felt that during the pandemic in particular. I noticed that amongst my colleagues. I noticed that with every new smartphone that I'm getting, I'm almost drawn to keep checking, just in case there might be an email waiting there for me. So it's this constant pull of electronic devices coupled with the amount of work that's being performed from home now since the commencement of the pandemic that has really generated, I think, a need for this right to disconnect. In terms of the figures around this really isn't something to be sneezed at. We have seen a substantial amount of overwork being performed in this country to the tune of about 5.4 hours on average per person per week. And if you accumulate that over the period of last year, a total of $131 billion worth of unpaid wages because of the work that people are performing outside of normal working hours that they are not getting paid for. And I would say that that figure to me is like particularly staggering. I would hope that with a right to disconnect, we start to see a substantial enough drop in that figure and the amount of overwork that's being performed. Now, I think about this right, and often a lot of the conversations that I have around it are people being afraid that it might stifle their flexibility at work, particularly for women in the workplace who may have a caring role, who say, well, look, I like to work flexibly. I pick up the kids at this time of the day and then I might do a little bit extra in the afternoon. And I would say absolutely we need to celebrate and support flexible work arrangements, and this right should not stifle that. But on the one hand, the flexibility is great. We should support that. But then on the other hand, we need to be mindful of the fact that flexibility should not also mean overwork and therefore underpayment. So we've got to strike the right balance and ensure that people are still disconnecting despite working flexibly. So I would say that at times we might see a bit of a darker side to working flexibly. Despite apparent benefits in working flexibly, we've seen flexibility give rise to substantially longer working hours, seeking into one's private time that might otherwise be dedicated to one's leisure, rest, and their family. And the fallout then becomes disrupted sleep, overwhelming stress, burnout, challenging relationships, and distracted carers as well. So when I think about then, how do we balance this right, and why do we still need it if we're trying to uphold flexibility, but then at the same time make sure that we're not seeping into someone's private life? I want to think about now the necessity for the right to disconnect from the employee's side, and then I'll think about it from the employer's side, because I think it's very important that we balance both. We've seen in studies, and these are mostly conducted in the realm of behavioural psychology, that monitoring emails continually can have harmful effects on one's well-being. I guess if I was to put it in a sentence, is that emails and constant connectivity can make you sick, it can make you unwell. In fact, a study has shown that the mere threat of being contacted outside one's normal working hours can have grave consequences for one's well-being. I curiously came across a study too that suggested that the longer that one spends on email in a given hour, the higher one's stress is for that hour. And this particular study looked at the level of sweat that people's bodies were producing when they spent time checking emails for an hour. So there's a clear physiological response from people being at their computer checking emails. They're getting the sweats up. So I also thought that that was interesting to see that this isn't just in my head. It's possible to actually have a physiological response to this. There was also a suggestion in a study that, okay, what if we get employees to batch emails and only check them in, say, a 2-hour period each afternoon of the workday? Will that make a difference to one's stress levels? The research data suggested that batching emails like that makes absolutely no difference to one's stress level, and you will be perpetually stressed anyway with the threat of email. Other researchers have also identified a connection between constant connectivity through work-related communications like phone calls and emails and unhappiness, so symptoms of depression. There's also been suggestions in other studies that smartphones and constant connectivity via email in particular has an extremely addictive quality. So the constant checking has been likened to symptoms of addiction. So I've thought about this, I guess, as a way of prefacing the right to disconnect, and why I would say that from an individual employee's perspective, this is a necessary and an important thing. But when we look at it from an employer's perspective, I would say that if we put things quite bluntly, the consequence for an employer, if they do not recognise a right to disconnect, could be incredibly risky and incredibly expensive. Without a direct recognition of the right, that's either developed at the employer's initiative or alternatively by Parliament, which we've seen now, there's the potential for an employer to breach their duty of care that they owe to their employee. So there's a potential work health and safety claim in the offing. There is the potential for an application for a stop order, which, if breached, carries significant potential for penalties under the Fair Work Act. There is also the potential for an adverse action claim, as I mentioned. To add to the list, very recently, in only the last month or so, there has been a workers' compensation claim brought in New South Wales where the employee suggested that she had been caused substantial stress by being emailed and contacted by her employer during a period of personal leave that she was taking. So much so that she claimed workers' compensation as a consequence of that. Even though the right to disconnect is not even in existence yet, the particular decision maker in that case said that because the right to disconnect is in the offing, and I recognise that, and this is part of the, zeitgeist of where Australian labour law is heading now, I'm going to award workers compensation here for the substantial stress that this employee has suffered as a consequence of being contacted outside working hours and during her leave period. So I would say then that notwithstanding the scary numbers and the substantial risk legally, there's also, a culture benefit for employers as well. By allowing employees to disconnect, not only do they free themselves of the potential for great legal risk, but we also see, I would hope, a benefit to productivity in the workplace, a lack of future employee burnout, and hopefully increases in employee availability and enthusiasm at work in the general sense. Now, speaking of enthusiasm at work, I would also predict that this very fresh new notion of quiet quitting will start to see a bit of a decline. I've got my lovely undergraduate law students to thank for alerting me to this video that was on TikTok, letting everyone know how one might quiet quit, that is, do the bare minimum at work while still getting paid your full salary. So I would say that with a right to disconnect, we'd see a decrease in that kind of mindset too. So I want to think now about some of the loopholes that are set to be closed by this new right to disconnect, and also mention some of the myths that have been flying around in the media. Now, in terms of what loopholes are to be closed, I've mentioned that we've seen declining rates of mental health and well-being for employers, but for employees alike. I would hope that we see, an uptake in general overall happiness in the workplace, with employees knowing that they can leave the workplace and not be obliged to be contacted outside their normal working hours. I would hope too that we see less of a blurred distinction between an employee's work life and then their private life. Because at the moment, it's awfully fuzzy, isn't it? I would hope that people then start to consider, well, what are my normal working hours? Is it reasonable for me to be contacted outside of those normal working hours? And if it is not, perhaps then I can just leave that be till tomorrow when I'm back at work. I'd hope too that we see some of the ongoing confusion about that reasonable additional hours section in the Fair Work Act clarified. I'd also hope that we see some more sensible limits placed on an employer's duty of care, because we know that an employer's duty of care will extend to wherever an employee is performing work. And if they are not obliged to perform work, and you're not requesting them to perform work outside their normal working hours, then the duty of care will have a clear barrier and a clear boundary. And hopefully too, we see a curb, or at least some decline, in the excessive amounts of unpaid work that Australian employees have been performing. $131 billion worth of unpaid wages is staggering to me. In terms of the myths that I've seen come up, that this means the end of flexibility. I would say that no, it certainly doesn't. The two can absolutely work hand in hand. It is about understanding what one's normal working hours are and then working backwards from there. There are some who have said that there is not a problem to be fixed. And in fact, when Jackie Lambie in Federal Parliament was suggesting that this right to disconnect was unnecessary Her reason for saying that was, well, none of my constituency have complained to me about not being able to disconnect from work. I don't see the problem here. But I would say, well, look, if you look at the data, it's clear. People are overworking and being underpaid. There's a myth too, I think, around the fact that this will set women back. I would say that, again, the level of flexibility that can be allowed can go hand in hand with a right to disconnect. There's been a suggestion that this is going to give rise to endless legal claims. Look, I would say that we are certainly going to see test cases on this. I think that that is without question. But what I would say is that if no one's challenging how much extra work they're doing, then what hope have people got for being paid for the work that they are actually performing and being paid properly? There's suggestion too that this won't work for multinational employers, particularly those that work across multiple time zones. I can hand on heart say that yes, it's going to be challenging if you work across multiple time zones. But I would say that you're probably already dealing with those kinds of challenges already. And that this might be a way of taking stock of who is performing work at what time. And actually considering, well, are we limiting liability and risk by considering the potential overwork that people are actually performing by reason of working across different time zones? I thought I'd pop up very briefly some headlines that caught my eye around these myths. For example, this has been labelled Labor's job-killing new IR world. We've had it said that a right to disconnect can be dismissed as a step back for flexibility. Again, I disagree with that. For those in the legal profession, this will be career ending if you decide to adhere to this right to disconnect. In order to get ahead, you must work harder. You must work longer hours. And again, for all of the reasons that I suggested earlier on about why this is necessary, not just from the employee's perspective, but the employer's as well, I would say that that is categorically wrong. And I would say that those junior lawyers in particular, and those in those client service industries where they are charging time, are probably at the greatest need for a right like this. So where to from here? I think this is the part that we've perhaps all been waiting for. What can I take away from today? Between now and the 26th of August, I think there are a few things that you could do to consider how and when communication happens in the place that you work. When is it that people are emailing you and requiring you to complete tasks? Could you open up a constructive discussion now to see whether you might be able to effect some change before this right actually comes into operation on the 26th of August? Is it the case maybe that an on-call allowance is necessary for the work that you are doing or for the work that your employees are doing for you? Do you have a policy that sets out how your workplace is going to operate alongside this right to disconnect? I would suggest that a policy document will be mighty helpful in making sure that people are across this. And in fact, us in the Adelaide Law School have a right to disconnect guideline, which has been implemented, I would say, fairly successfully. You can join the dots as to who put that one together. Can you identify then what might constitute reasonable and unreasonable out of hours contact for the sort of work that it is that you are doing? What might be considered reasonable in your role? What would be considered unreasonable? What behaviours could you yourself change? This is a bit of a moment for self-reflection. Are you the person that emails at 11 o'clock at night asking people to do things for the next day? Are you that person? Perhaps you're a Sunday afternoon bandit. So I would think about the sort of behaviour that you might adopt and model, particularly if you're in a managerial role, to make sure that you're leading by example, because only with that are we going to see the necessary change. I would say too that if you're wanting some further reading, the book that I have a picture of up on the right-hand side of the slide there, A World Without Email by Cal Newport, is a really great place to start in terms of some practical tips that you might implement yourself at work. I would say too now that I don't want to finish this with, I guess, a doom and gloom attitude, and I guess emphasising how much risk there is around not adhering to a right to disconnect. That is certainly existent. But what I would say is that this really is something to be celebrated by us. I feel like on the 26th of August, we'll almost be free from that shackle of feeling like we must respond because there is this right that underpins our workplace rights now. So I would say, rather than getting too fixated on the compliance aspect of it, to think about this from a point of view of, okay, this is actually something that is kind of revolutionary. Great. I would welcome any questions on this topic, whether it's from people in the audience here or at home.
To pop up here next to you. But thank you so much for that talk. It was really fantastic, and you really clearly described the laws and the importance of them for both the employee and the employer. And I'm really excited to see, I guess, the change that's going to occur over the next year or so, or more than that. So thank you. So we will open up to the floor for questions now. So if you have a question, just pop your hands up, and we've got some roving mics coming around that you'll be able to ask your question. And then if you're listening online, you can pop your question in the Q&A box and we can answer your question that way. So just to get the ball rolling, I can see we've already got some hands up, but I might just quickly ask one of the pre-submitted questions that we have here. So this question is, does the right to disconnect apply to all employees, or are there exceptions for various roles and lifestyle jobs?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are certainly workers who won't be affected by this. I'll acknowledge quite quickly who they are. Those who work in local or state government who aren't covered by the Fair Work Act are not afforded this right at this stage. I have also made note of the fact that those who earn above the high income threshold, and at this point in time, as of the 1st of July 2024, it is $167,500 plus and above. If you earn that much money, you don't have access to the right to disconnect. And also, if you are an independent contractor, so that is running your own business, you won't have access to a right to disconnect. But I would say still that, notwithstanding the fact that those categories of worker are not covered by this Fair Work Act amendment, that doesn't mean that they should not necessarily adopt the same kind of behaviours around disconnecting. I would say that just because a right to disconnect might not necessarily apply to you, particularly for those high income earners, if you are someone in a role like that, I would say that perhaps you are indeed most in need for a right to disconnect at that level. I would say too that it would allow you to then lead by example.
Fantastic, thanks for that. We just have a question
Hello, Gabrielle.
here.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Should be good.
This is more of a reflection. I've been in the university system for an awfully long time, and the culture of universities has been one of sort of continuity of thought, continuity of research, ongoing communication, really thinking about your work all night, which is not ideal. And this is a 9-to-5 model, and I was wondering how those two cultures fit together, since we're talking within a university system as well.
Look, I think that is something, and particularly so when, let's say, Nari, if you're working with international collaborators too, you're pulled in that direction as well. I would say that this will probably be something that takes time to shift and to kind of meld those two cultures. And I dare say that academia is not alone in the kind of thinking about work and processing work outside normal working hours, because inevitably our minds work that way, don't they? And I would say too that, with the constant pull of digital devices, it's made ever harder. But in saying all of that, we have now something that can underpin that sort of mind chatter, if you like, to say, well, actually, it's okay for you to not work now. You don't have to constantly be thinking about this.
I think we have a question from online just up the back there.
So we've got one from the healthcare field, and I'm asking if there's any advice to adhere to that, because it's quite difficult to implement.
I'm assuming in a healthcare field, this might be an area that is perhaps dictated a lot by shift work. And if that is the case, then an employee will obviously need to be available during the hours of their shift. And I can certainly appreciate that, let's say it's a doctor, for example, that is required to be on call. They should be getting paid an on-call allowance for the time that they are on call. So it may be a case that they need to actually think about, well, am I being paid appropriately for the time that I am actually working? And if it's the case that they're not, it's certainly advisable to start asking questions about that. Megan.
Hi, Gabrielle. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I have a question about the interaction between this right and the kind of myth that you identified about flexible work arrangements. And the question, I think, really pertains to what it means to actually violate someone's work or right to disconnect, rather. Is it the sending of emails or communications outside of normal hours that itself infringes the right? Or is it the sending of that kind of communication with the expectation that someone actually reads and responds to that? Because if it's the former, then could that not potentially infringe on flexibility in terms of working arrangements and working outside of normal hours?
I absolutely see the point. I think it's where we need to look back to what the Act says about what is and is reasonable contact outside someone's working hours. So the Act looks at things like the reason for someone's contact or their attempted contact. So why has someone contacted you? Is it related to an emergency situation? If so, I would say, well, that seems quite reasonable to contact someone about that. Looking at how the contact has occurred, is it continual emails? Is it lots of phone calls? And the level of disruption that is then caused by that. Perhaps it is the case that, like our employee in New South Wales who made the workers' compensation claim, created a huge psychosocial hazard for her. If that's the case, then maybe it's considered unreasonable in the circumstances there. The extent to which the employee is compensated for the time that they're required to be available. So let's say, for example, you are asked outside normal working hours to complete a work-related task, and therefore you're performing work and you're not being compensated for that time. I would suggest that starts to fringe on unreasonableness there. The Commission will also look at the nature of an employee's role and their level of responsibility within an organisation. So they consider levels of seniority as well as personal circumstances. So let's say you have a flexible working arrangement. Maybe it's the case that needs to still be upheld and respected at the same time as allowing you a right to disconnect. So there will be some teething issues, I think, when we're trying to juggle, okay, what is reasonable versus unreasonable contact, and how far does flexibility actually stretch there?
Just have another one here.
Thank you. My question was basically about the third parties. So I was interested to ask you a bit more detail about the penalties and how the penalties may or may not apply to third parties. What I understood from your slides was that employers, would incur penalties if there was a failure to stop or comply with the stop order. The stop orders apply to third parties? Can they apply to third parties? And if they do, are there penalties?
The stop order could. I would say, though, that by and large, it's going to be up to the employer to kind of manage the expectation of who the third party is involved, I guess who the third party is there. If it's the case that it's a customer or a client, I think to then go out and seek a stop order against that particular individual will actually be ignoring the fact that maybe this is a conversation that needs to happen between the employee and the employer who's engaged them, and then how they manage that external relationship. But of course, if the employer then places an expectation on the employee to respond to the third party, that I think is where they'll be encapsulated by the potential for a stop order. I would suggest that it'd be incredibly rare, unlikely for a stop order to be sought against someone outside of that direct employment relationship.
Thank you.
There's just another couple of questions at the back. The roving mics are just heading up.
Hello, I just wanted to ask about unpaid work. If you're a person, for instance, who is doing an unpaid traineeship or a person who is on a work placement, would these laws still apply?
The short answer is no, they won't, because you're not an employee within the definition of an employee under the Fair Work Act. Again, though, I will caveat that by saying those workers should still, to the best of their ability, I think, adhere to a right to disconnect for their own benefit and to ensure that whoever's engaged them is also limiting their risk too. I think that treating those workers differently and kind of, I guess, enhancing their vulnerability, which already exists by reason of their precarious work, is getting into some dangerous territory. But the short answer is that no, the law doesn't directly apply to them, but I would say it's still sensible for them to disconnect where possible.
We've got just another online question at the back.
So I've got two here. One is there a right to disconnect for employees not covered by an award?
Okay, so those employees not covered by an award are typically those who earn above the high income threshold. So again, that's our $167,500 mark and upwards. And so, yeah, I guess my short answer is no, those who aren't covered by a modern award for that reason won't be afforded a right to disconnect. But again, I feel like a broken record here. They should still, to the best of their ability, I think, try and adhere to that right to disconnect for their own benefit and for their employer too. For those who are covered instead by an enterprise agreement, they won't be covered by a modern award anymore. But the enterprise agreement in and of itself is underpinned by a modern award, and it can't provide for less than a modern award. So, but for that very reason, those covered by an enterprise agreement should still and will still have a right to disconnect.
I think, was there a second question online as well? Or? Oh, you covered it, no worries. Are there any more questions in the room? Because if not, I think we're almost on 6:30 anyway, so we can wrap it up there. So yes, thank you so much, Dr Gabrielle Golding, for your talk tonight. Thank you to the audience for your attendance as well and for all your wonderful questions. Be sure to sign up for our mailing list to get all the update information on our Research Tuesday event. And thanks for tuning in once again. Good night, everyone.